In the bitter cold of a Canadian winter, where icy winds cut through the bones of men and the river freezes under the weight of history, a battle unfolds that could change the fate of a fledgling nation. The year is 1775. The American Revolution rages south of the Canadian border, but the struggle is not confined to the 13 colonies. A daring expedition moves north, aiming to strike a decisive blow against the British stronghold of Quebec. Fear, hope, and desperation intermingle as soldiers march. Unseen dangers lurk in the forests, and the shadows of history prepare to witness a fight that will echo through time. The fate of rebellion, the hopes of liberty, and the price of courage converge in a city perched atop cliffs, overlooking the frozen St. Lawrence River. This is the story of the Battle of Quebec. Let's begin. The winter of 1775 was merciless, the kind of cold that gnawed through layers of clothing, seeped into bones, and turned rivers into sheets of unyielding ice. Yet, amidst this frozen world, a bold plan was taking shape. In the heart of the American colonies, the Revolution was gaining momentum. Victory in Boston had fueled the fires of rebellion, and the Continental Congress had set its eyes on an audacious goal: to bring Canada into the fight against British rule. To capture Quebec, the northern stronghold of British power, seemed a gamble drenched in both promise and peril. For the Americans, success would mean opening a new front, potentially gaining allies, and striking a psychological blow to the British Empire. Failure, however, could shatter morale and extinguish the fragile flame of revolution. Colonel Benedict Arnold, a name that would later resonate with both heroism and infamy, was tasked with leading a force of over 1,000 men through uncharted wilderness. Alongside him marched General Richard Montgomery, a seasoned officer who had once served in the British Army and now fought for the American cause. Their army was a mix of hardened soldiers, local militias, and untested volunteers, men whose courage often outweighed their discipline. They carried muskets, a handful of artillery, and supplies that were far too meager for the long journey that lay ahead. From Cambridge, Massachusetts, the expedition set off into the cold north, down winding rivers and through dense forests, guided by little more than maps that were incomplete and outdated. Snowstorms and icy terrain made progress slow, and the men faced threats that were not human. Swollen rivers, hidden rapids, freezing nights, and hunger gnawed at them relentlessly. Some men fell ill, some abandoned hope entirely and turned back. Morale wavered like the flickering flame of a candle in the wind. Yet Arnold pressed on, his determination steeled by the stakes of revolution. Every step forward was a testament to human resilience in the face of near-impossible odds. Meanwhile, General Montgomery took a separate force, advancing up the frozen Richelieu River. His strategy was meticulous, calculated, and driven by an understanding of the enemy's vulnerabilities. Montgomery knew that Quebec was heavily fortified, perched atop cliffs overlooking the St. Lawrence River, its walls manned by British troops and Canadian loyalists. The city was not just a military objective, it was a symbol. Capturing Quebec meant shaking British dominance in North America. Failing would embolden the crown and demoralize the rebels. The weight of history rested on the shoulders of men trudging through snow, their breaths misting in the frigid air, their hearts filled with both hope and dread. As Arnold and Montgomery marched separately through the wilderness, they faced a landscape as formidable as the enemy itself. Narrow trails twisted through snow-laden forests, rivers clogged with ice threatened to wash away entire rafts of supplies, and brutal storms reduced visibility to mere feet. Each night, the men huddled in tents or makeshift shelters, praying for survival and for a glimpse of fortune. The sounds of wolves in the distance, the cracking of ice, and the howling of wind created a soundtrack of nature's wrath, testing the resolve of every soldier. Arnold's journey was particularly grueling. His route required navigating the Quebec River and portaging over 30 miles of unforgiving terrain to reach the Showdown River, a vital path toward Quebec. Men collapsed from exhaustion, and many suffered frostbite. Food ran low. Small rations of flour, dried meat, and hardtack barely sustained them. Yet Arnaud inspired loyalty through sheer willpower. He encouraged his men with speeches about liberty, about the dream of a free continent, about the honor of striking a blow against tyranny. Some soldiers responded with vigor. Others endured in silent suffering, driven by duty, desperation, or the faint hope of glory. Montgomery's advance, while less tortuous in terrain, was no less dangerous. He moved through Lake Champlain, navigating frozen waters, while British forces stationed at forts along the way watched and prepared. The British, under Governor Guy Carleton, were aware of the American ambitions and had fortified Quebec accordingly. Carleton understood that the city's natural defenses, high cliffside overlooking a wide, frozen river were an advantage that could not be underestimated. Supplies were stockpiled, cannons positioned, and loyalist militias were ready to defend the Crown's stronghold. The Americans would face more than just a city. They would face preparation, strategy, and the determination of men fighting to protect their homes and their empire. As the forces approached Quebec from different directions, intelligence became a critical factor. Couriers moved along frozen rivers, snowbound trails, and dense forests, carrying messages that could decide the fate of the campaign. Communication delays and misinformation threatened to derail months of planning. Every decision was a gamble. Every misstep could spell disaster. Yet, the Americans pressed forward, driven by belief and a cause greater than themselves, by the vision of a continent free from colonial rule, and by the allure of historic achievement. The Americans' hardships were compounded by local conditions and Canadian sentiment. Not all Canadians were eager to join the revolution. Many remained loyal to the Crown, skeptical of the American promises, and wary of war encroaching on their land. Arnold and Montgomery had to balance diplomacy with military objectives, hoping to sway local support without alienating potential allies. The delicate interplay between conquest and persuasion added another layer of tension to an already perilous campaign. Night fell across the northern forests with a darkness that seemed absolute, broken only by the flicker of campfires and the glint of ice under the moonlight. Soldiers whispered prayers, told stories of home, and clutched letters from loved ones they might never see again. Morale was fragile, yet determination burned bright. Each day brought new challenges, and each challenge tested the limits of human endurance. Yet, amidst the cold, hunger, and uncertainty, a shared sense of purpose bound the men together. They were not just soldiers. They were pioneers on the edge of history, carrying the fragile hopes of revolution into the wilderness. By late November, Arnold's force finally emerged from the wilderness onto the Showdown River, battered, exhausted, and yet unbroken. They had survived the treacherous march, the freezing nights, and the constant threat of disaster. Each man who stumbled into camp carried the marks of hardship, frostbitten fingers, raw feet, and weary eyes, but also the quiet pride of survival. Arnold himself bore the weight of responsibility heavily. The lives of his men and the success of the expedition rested on his shoulders. He knew that the final leg of the journey would demand courage, cunning, and an unyielding spirit. Montgomery, advancing along a separate route, prepared his men for the assault that would bring them to the gates of Quebec. Training drills, reconnaissance missions, and careful planning occupied every waking hour. The men were aware that the coming confrontation would test every skill they possessed, every ounce of bravery they could muster. For many, it was their first encounter with a fortified city. For others, it was a chance to prove themselves on a stage that history would remember. The air was thick with anticipation, fear, and the silent understanding that the winter's trials were only the beginning. As Part 1 closes, the stage is set. The Americans, divided in their approaches, but united in purpose, stand on the precipice of a battle that could decide the future of the revolution in the north. The forests, rivers, and snow have tested their resolve, but the cliffs of Quebec loom ahead, a fortress of stone and a symbol of British might. Behind those walls, Governor Carleton watches and waits, knowing that the city is prepared for a siege. Ahead, the Continental Army marches, weary yet determined, into a confrontation that will demand all the courage, ingenuity, and resilience they can summon. The Battle of Quebec is not yet fought, but the seeds of destiny have been sown. In the freezing northern wilderness, amid snowdrifts and icy rivers, the men of the Revolution have already proven themselves capable of enduring the impossible. Now, as they approach the city that guards the northern frontier, the final test awaits. History watches silently, waiting to record which of them will triumph, which will falter, and which will be remembered as heroes or casualties of ambition. The winter winds blew harsher as December approached, turning the St. Lawrence River into a vast expanse of ice and frost. From a distance, the cliffs of Quebec rose like a jagged crown, sharp against the gray sky, a city of stone defiant against the elements and against the ambitions of the rebel forces. The American troops, worn by weeks of relentless march, stared at the fortress city with awe, fear, and determination. Quebec was not merely a city. It was a bastion of the British Empire in the north, a place fortified by walls, cannons, and the experience of men trained to defend it. To conquer it would require more than courage. It would demand cunning, endurance, and the willingness to risk everything. General Richard Montgomery, leading his column along the frozen Richelieu River, had advanced cautiously. Every movement had to be calculated. The river, frozen but treacherous, threatened to break under weight, and the snow-covered terrain concealed both danger and opportunity. Montgomery's men were alert, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of ambush, their muskets ready, their spirits tense. Each night, they camped on the icy banks, snow crunching beneath boots, while officers pored over maps, tracing routes and identifying weaknesses in the city's defenses. Colonel Benedict, Arnold's force, approaching from the northeast through the Showdown River route, faced a different set of challenges. Exhaustion hung heavy in the air. Frostbitten fingers and frozen toes were common among his men. Supplies had run dangerously low, forcing them to ration food and rely on the meager provisions they carried. The cold was unrelenting, and yet Arnold pressed forward with a resolve that inspired even the most weary soldiers. He knew that every day lost was a chance for the British to strengthen their defenses, and that hesitation could doom the expedition. As the Americans neared Quebec, intelligence became a critical factor. Spies and scouts reported that Governor Guy Carleton had prepared the city for a siege. Cannons were positioned along the walls, muskets loaded, and loyalist militias patrolled the surrounding areas. Carleton understood the value of Quebec, not only as a strategic point but as a symbol of British authority. Its loss would resonate across the colonies and the empire alike. Every detail of the city was designed to repel invaders. Narrow streets to funnel attackers, walls to break charges, and fortified gates to withstand assault. The Americans were walking into a fortress, but they were walking with the audacity of men who believed in a cause larger than themselves. Montgomery's men began reconnaissance missions, moving cautiously to gauge the strength of the defenses. They observed the city from elevated positions, noting the arrangement of fortifications and the positioning of sentries. Reports indicated that the garrison numbered around 1,500 men, well-trained and prepared. The intelligence was sobering, yet it did not deter the American commanders. They understood that timing and surprise would be crucial. A frontal assault without preparation could be catastrophic. Arnold's force faced its own perilous challenges. The treacherous winter landscape had taken a toll on both men and animals. Horses and mules, crucial for transporting supplies, often succumbed to cold or exhaustion. Men huddled around small fires, their breaths visible in the frigid air, attempting to thaw frozen fingers and regain strength. Disease and frostbite were constant threats, silently claiming those too weak to endure. Every step closer to Quebec was a struggle against nature itself, a trial that tested the limits of human endurance and willpower. The two forces, converging from different directions, communicated through messengers who braved snowstorms and enemy patrols. Coordination was difficult, and delays were inevitable. Yet, the shared purpose of capturing Quebec bound them together. Both Montgomery and Arnold understood that success depended not only on military strategy, but on the resilience and morale of their men. Encouragement speeches of liberty and promises of reward became tools as vital as muskets and cannons. The soldiers clung to hope as fiercely as they clutched their weapons. Within the walls of Quebec, Governor Carleton prepared his defenses with meticulous care. Loyalist militia, along with regular British troops, drilled in anticipation of the approaching threat. Cannons were aimed at key access points, gates were reinforced, and sentries kept vigilant watch. The citizens of Quebec, caught between fear and loyalty, observed the unfolding events with apprehension. Many prayed for safety, while others silently supported the British efforts, understanding that the city's fate would determine their lives. Carleton's strategy was simple but effective. Fortify, wait, and exploit the vulnerabilities of the attackers. As the Americans drew closer, skirmishes began to erupt along the outskirts. Small detachments of loyalists and British scouts clashed with militia, testing the resolve and skill of the advancing forces. These minor engagements, though brief, provided critical lessons. They revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both sides, shaping tactics for the forthcoming main assault. Every encounter heightened tension, sharpened nerves, and reinforced the reality that the coming battle would not be a mere test of strength, but a trial of endurance, courage, and strategy. Arnold's men finally reached the vicinity of the Showdown River, weary but alive, their eyes fixed on Quebec across the frozen expanse. The cliffs loomed large, their shadow casting a sense of foreboding over the landscape. Yet, within the American ranks, a quiet determination simmered. These men had endured months of hardship, cold, hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty, and no, faced with the final barrier, they were resolute. Each soldier knew the stakes. Victory could ignite revolution in Canada. Defeat could extinguish it. The air was heavy with anticipation, and every step forward felt like a step into history. Montgomery's troops, positioned along the St. Lawrence, began to plan the assault in earnest. Artillery was arranged for bombardment, and detailed plans were drawn to exploit weak points in the city's defenses. Montgomery understood that the Americans were outnumbered and outgunned, but he believed in the power of surprise, coordination, and the audacity of his men. His leadership inspired confidence, but the uncertainty of the coming battle cast long shadows over the camp. Every night, fires flickered, conversations were hushed, and the weight of responsibility pressed upon officers and men alike. As December 30th approached, the tension reached its peak. Snowfall covered the ground, muffling footsteps and creating an eerie silence across the landscape. Scouts returned with news of movements within the city, adjustments to fortifications, and the readiness of British forces. Each report added to the urgency, a reminder that time was slipping away, and that the Americans needed to act decisively. Preparations intensified, weapons were cleaned and checked, and men rehearsed maneuvers under the gray winter sky. Arnold and Montgomery, coordinating their efforts, faced the final challenge of synchronization. The two columns, approaching from different directions, had to time their actions perfectly to maximize impact. Communication was fraught with difficulty, and any misstep could lead to disaster. Yet both commanders displayed remarkable determination, weighing risk against opportunity, courage against prudence, and vision against reality. Their decisions in these final hours would determine the course of history. For victory or defeat in Quebec could alter the fate of the revolution in ways unimaginable. The night before the planned assault, soldiers lay in their tents or huddled in makeshift shelters, hearts pounding with anticipation. Whispers of fear, hope, and longing filled the air. Some men wrote letters to loved ones, unsure if they would survive to deliver them. Others prayed silently, clutching talismans, tokens of faith, or reminders of home. Yet, amidst the anxiety, a shared sense of purpose united them. They were part of something larger than themselves, part of a movement that sought to challenge empire, claim liberty, and redefine the boundaries of freedom. Montgomery spent hours reviewing plans, pacing along the frozen ground, weighing every decision with meticulous care. Arnold inspected his men, offering words of encouragement and addressing concerns. The leaders understood that the coming day would test not only strategy but the character of every soldier. Courage, discipline, and resolve would be as crucial as muskets and cannons. The city of Quebec, looming above them, seemed to embody both challenge and destiny, a sentinel of history awaiting the outcome of men willing to confront the impossible. As dawn approached and the day of the assault, a brittle calm settled over the American forces. Snowflakes drifted through the air, covering footprints and disguising movements. The frozen river shimmered under the pale light, a deceptive path to the city that promised danger at every step. The soldiers, weary yet alert, prepared to advance, each breath visible in the frigid air. They tightened coats, adjusted packs, and whispered final words of resolve. Across the cliffs, Quebec awaited, its walls silent, its defenders watchful, its fate about to be contested in a clash that would echo through the annals of history. The siege was imminent. Months of preparation, weeks of grueling march, and days of anticipation converged on this single, decisive moment. The men of the Continental Army, led by Montgomery and Arnold, faced not just a fortified city, but the weight of history itself. Each soldier carried the hopes of a fledgling nation, the aspirations of liberty, and the courage to confront overwhelming odds. The stage was set, the players were ready, and the moment of reckoning approached. The Battle of Quebec was no longer a distant threat, it was here, looming large in the minds of every man who dared to dream of revolution. The dawn of December 31st, 1775, arrived like a quiet prelude to chaos. The frozen St. Lawrence glimmered under a pale winter sun, its icy surface reflecting the shadows of soldiers advancing toward the city. The cliffs of Quebec loomed above, jagged and unyielding, the city's walls stretching like the teeth of a predator prepared to strike. The silence of early morning belied the storm to come. Every breath hung in the frigid air. Every movement was amplified by the tension, and every heartbeat echoed with the weight of destiny. For the Continental Army, the moment they had marched months to reach had finally arrived. The assault on Quebec, a city fortified by nature, man, and the resolute will of the British Crown. General Richard Montgomery surveyed the scene, his gaze sweeping the frozen river, the snowy slopes, and the high walls that shielded the enemy. His soldiers, weary yet resolute, waited in tense anticipation. Montgomery knew the stakes. A decisive victory could open Canada to the Revolution, but failure could shatter morale and extinguish the Northern Campaign. He checked his men's equipment, adjusted orders, and gave a final, stirring speech. Words of courage, liberty, and honor were meant to steel their nerves against the terror that awaited. Across the frozen landscape, the Continental forces prepared to move into history, fully aware that each step could be their last. Colonel Benedict Arnold, approaching from the Showdown River, faced a different kind of challenge. The terrain forced his men to climb icy slopes, their fingers numb, their feet raw, their bodies screaming in protest. Supplies were dangerously low. Food had become a token of survival, and yet the soldiers pressed onward, driven by a mixture of fear, hope, and sheer determination. Arnold himself was a figure of relentless energy, moving among the troops, urging them forward, scolding where necessary, praising courage wherever he found it. His presence was a lighthouse amidst the storm of exhaustion and fear, guiding men who had already endured more than any human should. The city of Quebec, under Governor Guy Carleton, was ready. Cannons lined the walls, muskets were loaded, and sentries patrolled every access point. Carleton understood that the Americans had suffered during their long march and that winter itself had already claimed many casualties. Yet he knew that desperation could make soldiers fearless, reckless, and deadly. Every defense had been strengthened, every gate reinforced, every alley surveyed. Quebec was a fortress not only of stone but of strategy, prepared to test the resolve of the attackers in every conceivable way. Montgomery's plan relied on surprise and coordination. The American forces would split into several columns, moving from different directions to converge upon the city simultaneously. The idea was simple in theory, but perilous in practice. Snowdrifts concealed obstacles, streets twisted in unexpected ways, and defenders knew every corner, every choke point. Timing was everything. Yet the cold had already delayed movements, and miscommunication could doom the plan before it even began. Montgomery's men tightened their grips on their muskets, adjusted their formations, and stepped forward into the snow, each crunching footstep an echo of imminent confrontation. Arnold's force approached from the northeast, climbing the icy slopes toward the city gates. Frostbite had claimed some of the soldiers, and hunger gnawed relentlessly at the rest. Yet their eyes reflected a fierce determination. These men had crossed rivers, trudged through forests, and endured storms that would have broken ordinary men. Now, facing the walls of Quebec, they understood the true test of endurance and courage. Arnold shouted orders, directed movements, and reassured the men, reminding them that victory was within reach. If they pressed forward with resolve, the climb was steep, the rocks slick with ice, yet every soldier pressed on, knowing that turning back was not an option. The first volleys of cannon fire erupted as the Americans neared the city walls. The sound was deafening, reverberating across the frozen river and snow-laden streets. Muskets cracked, and shouts of command echoed amidst the smoke and chaos. The defenders had anticipated the approach routes and poured volleys of lead and iron into the advancing columns. Soldiers fell, some screaming in pain, others in silent resignation. The snow beneath their feet became stained with the blood of men whose courage had driven them too close to death. Yet the Americans pressed on, inspired by duty, belief in liberty, and the unyielding will of their commanders. Montgomery's column struck first at the lower town, attempting to breach gates and force their way through the narrow streets. The defenders fought with tenacity, using barricades, sharpshooting from windows, and rolling obstacles to halt the attackers. The narrow streets became a labyrinth of death, echoing with musket fire, the clash of bayonets, and cries of the wounded. Every step forward was paid for with sweat, blood, and the courage of men who understood the stakes. Yet the Americans' momentum was gradually slowed by the defenders' preparation and the brutal conditions. Fatigue and fear began to take their toll, even before the heart of the city was reached. Arnold's column attempted a simultaneous attack from the upper town, aiming to surprise the defenders and create openings. The climb to the walls was treacherous, icy slopes causing soldiers to slip, fall, and sometimes roll back into snowdrifts. Cannon fire and musket shots rained down, turning every step into a gamble with death. Yet Arnold's leadership kept men moving forward. He led charges, encouraged those who faltered, and exploited any weakness in the defenders' lines. Small groups broke through barricades, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The streets echoed with the clang of bayonets striking metal, the screams of the wounded, and the rallying cries of men desperate to claim victory or survive. As the battle raged, Montgomery pushed his forces toward the heart of the city. His bravery was remarkable, but fate was cruel. In the midst of the assault, he was struck down by a volley of musket fire. The news of his fall rippled through the ranks, a shock that could have broken any force. Yet the soldiers, driven by both grief and determination, pressed on. Leadership shifted, but the objective remained. The soldiers had come too far, suffered too much, to turn back now. Every alley, every street, every barricade became a test of endurance, courage, and the will to survive. Arnold, unaware initially of Montgomery's fate, continued his assault with relentless energy. The defenders, recognizing the Americans' determination, intensified their efforts. Snow and ice became deadly obstacles, not just from the elements but as strategic tools for defense. Men slipped under fire, artillery raked through columns, and resistance from the city itself grew fiercer with every passing hour. The Americans were exhausted, their bodies screaming in protest. Yet the drive to succeed, to conquer, to claim a historic victory, pushed them forward. The fighting spilled into the very streets of Quebec. Houses became barricades, alleyways turned into killing zones, and every inch of ground was contested. The Americans, despite their courage, faced the brutal reality of attacking a fortified city in winter. Ammunition ran low, officers were down, and coordination began to fray under the pressure of combat. The initial momentum that had carried them forward through the wilderness was now tested against stone walls, disciplined defenders, and the unforgiving hand of fate. Arnold himself was wounded during the assault, sustaining injuries that would leave him temporarily incapacitated. Yet even as pain coursed through him, he refused to yield, continuing to inspire those around him with words, gestures, and unyielding resolve. His men, seeing their leader fight through agony, found renewed strength. Small victories were won, barriers breached, houses entered, and pockets of defenders overpowered, but the city as a whole remained The winter, the terrain, the defenders, and sheer exhaustion combined to form an invisible wall, challenging every effort of the American forces. As night approached, the Americans were forced to retreat to temporary positions. The dream of an immediate conquest of Quebec had faltered under the weight of reality. Casualties were severe. Dozens lay dead in the snow, dozens more wounded, shivering and bleeding. The surviving soldiers regrouped, tending to the injured as best they could, mourning their fallen and preparing for what might come next. The city had withstood the assault, its walls intact, its defenders resolute, its future still in British hands. Despite the failure of the initial assault, the battle left an indelible mark. The Americans had demonstrated extraordinary courage, endured impossible hardships, and fought against overwhelming odds. The defenders of Quebec had proven their strength, but the Americans had shown that even the most formidable city could be challenged by determination, bravery, and the unyielding will of men driven by a cause greater than themselves. The winter's chill, the treacherous terrain, and the chaos of combat had tested every soldier to the limits of human endurance, leaving scars, memories, and a story that would echo through history. As the night settled over Quebec, the frozen river reflecting the city's walls like a mirror, Both sides understood the stakes had changed. The Americans, though battered, were not broken. The British defenders, though victorious in repelling the assault, recognized the determination and audacity of their opponents. The Battle of Quebec had reached a climactic point, where courage, strategy, and endurance collided in brutal reality. History waited silently, recording the valor, the sacrifice, and the unfolding drama of a battle that would be remembered for generations. The dawn, after the failed assault on Quebec, brought with it a cold, bitter reality. Snow fell silently over the city, covering the streets that had run red with blood, blanketing both the fallen and the surviving in a ghostly white shroud. The Continental Army, battered and demoralized, had endured months of treacherous marshes, brutal weather, and relentless hardship, only to meet a fortress that seemed impregnable. The cliffs of Quebec, once distant and foreboding, now appeared as sentinels of fate, watching the rebels retreat and marking the limits of ambition in a winter that showed no mercy. General Richard Montgomery lay dead, his body taken by the snow and carried to the walls by the British. His leadership had inspired men to extraordinary feats, yet even courage and determination were not enough against the combined defenses of Quebec and the unforgiving winter. For the soldiers who had followed him through forests, rivers, and snow-laden trails, the loss was devastating, not only a tactical blow, but a moral one. The death of Montgomery symbolized the human cost of ambition, the fragility of plans, and the harsh reality of war. Colonel Benedict Arnold, wounded yet unbroken in spirit, regrouped the surviving troops. His injury, a severe leg wound, would prevent him from leading further charges, but his presence remained a rallying point. The retreat was orderly but heavy with despair. Supplies were depleted. Frostbite claimed more men than muskets had, and the dream of a quick Canadian victory had dissolved into the harshness of reality. The soldiers moved cautiously, aware that British patrols and Loyalist forces could still exploit their weakened state. Yet even in retreat, there was a sense of resilience and acknowledgement that survival itself was a victory after the relentless trials of the march and battle. Governor Guy Carleton, vigilant and calculating, consolidated his victory. The city remained under British control, its walls unbroken, and its garrison prepared for further attacks. Carleton recognized that the American forces, though defeated, had shown remarkable courage and persistence. He strengthened defenses further, wary that another assault might come, knowing that the Americans had already demonstrated a capacity for endurance and audacity that could not be underestimated. The victory secured Quebec for the crown, but it came with the realization that the revolutionary spirit north of the colonies was persistent and resilient. The consequences of the Battle of Quebec were profound. For the Americans, the failed assault marked the end of the first major northern campaign of the Revolution. Canada would remain largely loyal to Britain, and the hopes of quickly expanding the rebellion northward were dashed. Casualties were severe. Hundreds of men were killed, wounded, or captured, and the harsh winter claimed even more through exposure, frostbite, and disease. The psychological impact was just as significant. Soldiers who had endured months of hardship were now confronted with the stark truth of failure, testing their resolve and the morale of the fledgling army. Yet, amid defeat, lessons were learned. The campaign highlighted the importance of logistics, preparation, and local intelligence. The treacherous winter marshes, insufficient supplies, and fragmented coordination revealed the limitations of American planning in hostile and unfamiliar territory. Officers like Arnold and surviving commanders carried these lessons forward, refining strategies, building resilience, and understanding the brutal realities of military engagement. The Battle of Quebec became a case study in ambition and the limits of human effort against both nature and fortified opposition. For the men who survived, the retreat from Quebec was a harrowing journey. They retraced the paths through forests and frozen rivers, often facing starvation and illness. The wilderness that had challenged them on the march north now tested them again on the retreat. Yet even in adversity, there was camaraderie, determination, and a quiet defiance. Stories emerged of soldiers caring for the injured, sharing the last of their rations, and enduring the cold together. These acts of human resilience became the unsung narratives of the campaign, reminders that history is shaped not only by victory, but by the courage to persist in the face of overwhelming odds. The failed attack also had political ramifications. Within the Continental Congress and among the revolutionary leadership, debates arose about the wisdom of northern expansion. the allocation of resources, and the command of officers. Montgomery's death, Arnold's injury, and the high casualty rate prompted critical reflection on leadership, strategy, and the limits of ambition. Yet, these reflections also fueled determination. The American Revolution would not be deterred by a single failure. Instead, the Battle of Quebec became a catalyst for learning, adaptation, and renewed commitment to the cause of independence. In Canada, the impact of the battle was equally significant. Loyalists and neutral inhabitants witnessed the determination and bravery of the American forces. Even as the city remained under British control, the encounter left an impression of both fear and respect. Some Canadians were convinced of the Americans' audacity, while others reinforced loyalty to the Crown. The battle also demonstrated the strategic importance of Quebec's geography, its natural defenses, and the necessity of preparedness in the face of insurgent threats. The city's endurance became a symbol of British strength, but it was a strength challenged by the boldness of men who dared to defy empire. The human stories that emerged from the battle had a depth to its historical significance. Ordinary soldiers, volunteers, and militia members faced unimaginable hardships. Tales of courage, sacrifice, and endurance circulated among survivors and later chroniclers. Some men froze to death on the retreat. Others succumbed to wounds untreated in the brutal winter. Families waited anxiously for news, unaware that letters and reports would be delayed or lost. Yet, despite suffering and loss, the shared experience forged bonds of loyalty and identity that would endure beyond the battlefield. These narratives, often overshadowed by the political and military analyses, captured the essence of human resilience amidst the tumult of revolution. Arnold, recovering from his wounds, became a symbol of perseverance, though his name would later be marred by infamy for different reasons. At Quebec, he embodied the relentless drive of men committed to a cause greater than themselves. His leadership under extreme conditions, the ability to inspire men suffering in freezing cold, and the tactical decisions made in the face of disaster exemplified both brilliance and courage. The story of Arnold at Quebec became a reminder that history is shaped by individuals whose decisions, for better or worse, carry weight far beyond the moment. Montgomery's legacy, sealed in the frozen streets of Quebec, was one of heroism and sacrifice. His death, tragic yet noble, became a rallying point for morale in other theaters of the Revolution. Letters, memoirs, and later histories celebrated his leadership, the audacity of his campaign, and the bravery of the men who followed him. The Battle of Quebec, though a tactical defeat, became a testament to the willingness of the revolutionary forces to confront impossible odds, to challenge empire, and to endure suffering in pursuit of liberty. The retreat into the winter wilderness was not merely a withdrawal, but a test of survival. Soldiers faced snowdrifts, frozen rivers, and dwindling supplies as they moved southward. Illness and frostbite claimed many who had survived the battle, leaving scars on those who endured. Yet the retreat also preserved the core of the American forces, allowing lessons to be learned, leadership to be re-evaluated, and future campaigns to be planned with greater understanding of the realities of warfare in harsh climates. The endurance shown during this retreat added to the mythology of the Continental Army as a force capable of surviving, adapting, and persisting against overwhelming challenges. In the aftermath, historians and chroniclers reflected on the significance of the Battle of Quebec. It was not merely a failed siege. It was a dramatic episode that revealed the limits and potentials of the revolutionary forces. Geography, weather, logistics, and leadership intertwined to create a scenario where courage was tested to its maximum. The Americans' failure underscored the difficulty of translating bold ideas into practical military success, particularly in hostile and unfamiliar territory. Yet it also showcased the tenacity of men committed to principles of liberty, willing to endure suffering for a vision of a new world free from colonial rule. The echoes of Quebec reverberated through the remainder of the American Revolution. Lessons learned there influenced future northern campaigns, informed strategic planning, and shaped the understanding of logistical and environmental challenges. Leaders carried the memory of frostbitten marshes, snowbound assaults, and urban combat into subsequent battles. Soldiers who survived became part of a shared narrative of endurance and courage, a story told and retold in letters, diaries, and later histories. The Battle of Quebec, while a defeat, became an enduring chapter in the saga of a revolution that would eventually succeed, highlighting both the costs and the indomitable spirit required to challenge empire. As winter gradually receded, the frozen St. Lawrence returned to its natural rhythm. The streets of Quebec to their quiet vigilance, and the men of the Continental Army to reflection and planning. The northern campaign had failed, but the revolution persisted. The sacrifices of Montgomery, Arnold, and their soldiers became a testament to human resilience, ambition, and the pursuit of ideals. History would remember the Battle of Quebec, not only for its failure, but for the courage, endurance, and determination it revealed. It was a story of men confronting the impossible, of a fledgling nation testing its limits, and of the harsh, unforgiving intersection of human ambition and the forces of nature. The Battle of Quebec ended, but its lessons endured. It reminded future generations that victory is never guaranteed, that courage alone does not secure success, and that the pursuit of freedom often demands sacrifices whose weight is measured not just in lives lost, but in endurance, resilience, and the unwavering commitment to ideals. The frozen streets, the bloodied snow, and the cliffs of Quebec stood silent witness to these truths, etching into history a dramatic chapter of the American Revolution, a chapter of hope, hardship, and heroism that would echo across time. As the snow settles and the echoes of muskets fade into history, we remember the courage, sacrifice, and unyielding spirit of those who dared to challenge the impossible. The Battle of Quebec may have ended in defeat, but the fire of revolution burned brighter than ever. If you felt the tension, the bravery, and the relentless human spirit through this story, don't let it end here. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and join us on the next journey through history, where we uncover more battles, more heroes, and the moments that shaped the world. History waits for no one. Will you be there to witness it?